pause, you'll be able to do that as well. So when you're working your way through this activity, you'll go to your Google form. If you are somebody who's watching this recording, you will click on this document to do the activity that we're doing today. It'll bring you right here, make a copy here. I'll read to you what's happening here. You can ask any questions you want to, and I'm going to ask you to pretend that you are a Supreme Court justice when you are answering how you would behave if you were on the Supreme Court listening to this court case. So I don't see any questions popping up yet, so we'll get through your court cases. And then, like I mentioned, for this week, you should be looking things over for your test that'll be coming up later on this week. We'll be giving you more details tomorrow as far as what that looks like. For you guys, though, the Supreme Court in the 1960s and 1970s dealt with the fact that after 1954, the Supreme Court had now argued that schools could not remain segregated. Many places did not want to desegregate their schools, as you saw in your civil rights video when you were watching what happened in Little Rock in 1957. There are many places that played around with ways to get around the Brown decision. Like in the South, if you've ever seen private schools like Providence Academy or religious schools like Benilde St. Margaret, those become incredibly popular in the South because if you're a private school or you're a religious school, you don't have to obey federal laws for desegregation. And so for many places in the South, those become the ways that they then try to work their way around the rules to try to desegregate the schools that have been segregated ever since the 1800s. During this time period, we had many students who argued along with the NAACP and the Justice Department that desegregation was still needed, even though we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm going to want you to consider when you listen to each of these court cases, then, the Supreme Court gets to listen to the detailed explanations of how states are and are not trying to desegregate. And they have to decide, are the things that they're seeing constitutional and legally okay with the ruling that they made for Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. So in your first court case you're going to be analyzing today, we're going to be taking a look at Green versus County School Board of New Kent County in 1968. During the Lyndon Johnson presidency in Eastern Virginia, you have a situation taking place where different states and counties came up with different ideas for desegregating their schools. In 1965, New Kent County in Virginia, which was a part of the Confederacy just east of Washington, D.C., it is considered the South, and they do have segregation taking place, even though the people are living in communities that are farm communities that are integrated, which means white and black people are living in the same neighborhoods. They're being forced to go to two different schools, the Watkins School, which was considered the black school, and the New Kent School, which was considered the white school. What they decided to do, though, is they said to desegregate. They created a freedom of choice plan that told kids in the district, you get to choose which of these two schools you would like to go to. The problem they had, though, is after 3 years of the new plan, there were no white kids who chose to leave their school, New Kent, and go to the formerly all-black school of Watkins. And only 115 African-American students chose to go to the New Kent school, even though they had the opportunity to desegregate. The black children, though, made this claim that the freedom of choice plan put all the burden of desegregation on their shoulders. So imagine your situation going to school, where if you go to school on a daily basis, you have to deal with the teachers, the students, the parents, many of whom don't want you there. And if you're the only student in your class or in your grade, that is an awful burden to try to take on. And many of the kids are choosing to stay in segregated schools rather than being hassled in that sort of way. Many of them also remember what happened to Emmett Till just a decade earlier. And so many of them are nervous about being the ones who try to desegregate their schools. Now, technically, they have put into place a law that will allow the desegregation of their schools. The question that you have, and I want you to put it here, and I'm looking for 3 solid sentences of your position and analysis why you think you're right. I want you to explain, do you believe that what the New Kent County School is doing is constitutional and it's an acceptable way to desegregate based on the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education ruling? I'm going to give you a couple minutes then to write here. So make a copy of this document, type your answer. I'm watching the chat so I can get to your questions. So Ava, what was the standpoint of Hispanics and other nationalities? Great question. So Ava, what's going to be happening when we take a look at these court cases? These court cases are predominantly tying back to Brown. But when we get to the third court case, you're going to see in the city of Denver, when you start getting to places that have other ethnic populations that are also facing discrimination, they will also get rolled into these court cases. But at this point, what we're analyzing is the pressure that's being brought by the civil rights movement that's already taking place to desegregate schools that have faced traditional racism from the slavery and then discrimination we had after the Civil War. In particular, and this is something where if we do end up coming back to school with one another, we've got a really good video that we show called Walkout, where you have students in Los Angeles who are a part of the Chicano movement who are going to be trying to figure out ways to do the same in their schools that you see African Americans pursuing in these court cases. Your question is fantastic. So again, I'll give you a couple more minutes to jot down your answer here, and then I'll explain to you what the Supreme Court actually did. And again, I'm looking for your opinion, and I realize I've got people in this classroom who are of different political viewpoints. Some of you guys are conservative, and you get nervous about the idea of the government intruding into private business. Some of you guys are liberal, and you guys see the government as an agent for change. And so there's a really good chance that given your viewpoints in politics, you may have very different views on what should or should not be happening in this court case. But I'll give you about one more minute to write down your answers. And I'm watching the chat. If anybody needs more time, please just give me a heads up in the chat. But otherwise, I'm going to get started in about 15 seconds. I see that I've got people who are just joining right now. And so what you will find is on my US History Google page, I've got a document that says Civil Rights Court Cases. We are currently working through case studies of Supreme Court cases. This is currently being recorded. And so you'll be able to watch whatever you've missed to this point. But what I'm doing is I'm sharing Supreme Court cases that dealt with the desegregation of schools, giving you a chance to kind of play the role of being a Supreme Court justice, and I'll let you know what the Supreme Court was up to. So does anybody need more time? Good, good. So if you take a look, you've got a section on your sheet then that says, what did the Supreme Court actually rule? That's going to be what I want you to be ready to type about. And I don't want you to write down this word for word. Instead, I want you to get the gist of what the Supreme Court argued. So the Supreme Court during this time was still the Warren Supreme Court. So Earl Warren, the guy who came up with the Brown decision, is still the head of the Supreme Court in 1968. And what he decides is he says that if the Supreme Court finds that there's a school district like this one that still is holding on to remnants of segregated school systems like they had during the time of Brown, the addition of the idea of freedom of choice isn't enough. So what they argued is that the Supreme Court is going to require the school system to tear out all of their racist systems like a weed. The phrase that they use is they have to tear it out root and branch. So if you've ever torn out a weed from the ground and you only pop the top, the roots are still there and the weed is still going to pop up again. So what they argued is they have to tear out their entire segregationist system. That means that they need to desegregate their faculty and their facilities. So the teachers, there should be white and black schools that are teachers that are put into each school. The facilities should be desegregated. Their activities and their sports teams should be desegregated. Their transportation should be desegregated. And what they call these from this point forward is going to be called green factors. And so if you ever hear that in the future, it's referring back to this case where they're going to take a look and they're going to set up a system of ideas of this is what true desegregation looks like. And they're going to be arguing that you have to do more than just give the kids a choice. You actually have to do something to bring desegregation to your school. As we get ready to move forward, I'm checking the chat and I'm also listening to see if any microphones unmute. Are there any questions you then have about the Green decision? Cool. So let me show you then why this is important. And if you're wondering right now about the presidential election, what we're finding is that the president's approval rating, President Trump's, is staying about the same right now. However you feel about him, positive or negative, he's not seeing his ratings either go up or down a ton at this point. And for the people who really like President Trump, they very much are eager to point out that what he is doing right now is similar to what Richard Nixon is going to get done in the 1960s and 70s in what's known as his Southern strategy. And so we're about to move in our next unit to a period where Richard Nixon is going to slow down civil rights. He's not going to do that by being openly angry about civil rights. Instead, he's just going to stop doing the stuff that Lyndon Johnson did to push for more rights for people. He's going to instead let people like the NAACP bring court cases to the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court rules like they did in the Green case, Richard Nixon is going to come out and go, oh my goodness, I mean, look at the court. They're now getting into your business. They're making the government bigger. And he makes the argument, if you don't like how the court system is getting involved in how you run stuff at the local level, you should vote for more Republicans so they can put into place more judges who are more conservative rather than more liberal. So when you take a look at where we are currently in our politics, President Trump has been very successful putting people onto the Supreme Court and to other court positions, and they're taking positions that are fairly conservative on issues like LGBT rights or abortion or other sorts of topics that many conservatives feel that liberals have been getting a little bit too interested in. So when we take a look at our second court case right here, this court case is going to be dealing with segregation in the South as well. This is in North Carolina. And when we take a look at this court case, this is in 1971 during the Nixon presidency, and this is with our new Supreme Court that has Warren Burger as the head of it. Richard Nixon, by this point, had started putting people onto the Supreme Court who are more conservative in their views, and they believed more in letting states handle desegregation rather than the federal government. So in this court case in North Carolina, you had a school district that was part city, part farm country, and if you think your school district is big, this one covered 550 square miles, had 84,000 pupils, and had 101 schools. And so our school district is about a tenth of this size. The population was 29% African American, and most of those kids were concentrated in one small part of Charlotte, North Carolina, and that was just one small element of the entire district. Even after the Brown decision, more than half of the African American kids were in schools that didn't have any white students or any white teachers because they were sending kids to schools based on what their geography was. And so they would go to a school that was nearby where they lived. After the Green decision, the federal district court in the area came up with a brand new plan to desegregate. And the plan was called busing. And this becomes a huge issue in the 1960s and 70s. And Richard Nixon in particular is going to be very much highlighting the fact that for people living out in the suburbs, busing makes them very anxious. So what busing was it said that they were going to buy brand new buses, 100 of them. It would cost millions of dollars, and they would take kids from the Charlotte neighborhood that they lived in, and they would send them by bus to neighboring suburban schools for the effort of desegregating in that sort of way. The argument was that because of where your neighborhoods were located, if they just relied on neighborhoods, you would have black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods, and even though we had the Civil Rights Act of 1968 making housing discrimination illegal, many people who were in black neighborhoods were trapped there because they couldn't afford to move to the more expensive white suburban neighborhoods. So we were still segregated. So for you guys, what I would like you to do, please, is I'd like you to determine, does this seem like an appropriate way to desegregate? Does it seem like it's constitutional and the right path? Or does this feel like it's going too far? In about 3 sentences, jot down your position, and I'll share with you what the Supreme Court actually ruled. Also, keep in mind it is totally appropriate if you want to unmute your microphone to ask questions, or else if you want to type in the chat, feel free to ask anything. Take about one more minute to finish up with your three sentences about whether or not you think this busing solution is the appropriate way to desegregate and whether or not you think this is constitutional. And again, if you jumped in late, where your grade is coming from, this part right here is going to be the most important part to your grade. I'm checking for three sentences where you take a position and you provide good analysis to explain why you feel the way that you do. Then I'll also be giving you credit for jotting down what I describe as the court's actual decision. And we'll be doing that in about a minute. All right, so here's the Supreme Court decision. I'm checking the chat to see if anybody panics and needs more time, but I'm not seeing anything yet. What the Supreme Court decided was that the argument that was being used by the North Carolina Charlotte School District, that, hey, we're just going to send kids to whatever school they live closest to, that argument was not effective. It did not work because what the Supreme Court argued is that in the South, you had racially determined housing patterns based on the racism that people had experienced for decades and centuries. And so because of slavery, because of segregation, Jim Crow laws, and whatever, you had black people living in one area, white people living in another area. So if you just announce, well, we built a school next to where people were living, that's still maintaining the segregation of the past. So what was determined in the Swan decision is that solutions like busing or other sorts of solutions, the Supreme Court ruled that desegregation must be achieved in each of the district schools to the greatest extent possible. And if it meant busing was needed to do that, then they should be using busing to desegregate the school district. During the Nixon presidency, then becomes a campaign issue because for many white people in the suburbs, busing is going to cost tax money. And it's also going to be taking kids from black neighborhoods into white neighborhoods. And in both the South and the North, that will create racial tensions that are very much going to start flaring during the 1970s. And for Richard Nixon, he'll highlight the idea that what the Supreme Court is ruling right here is going too far. So he'll enforce this decision, but he'll also complain about it. In case number 3, you have a court case of Keys versus School District Number 1 in Denver, Colorado. This is during the Nixon presidency after he got reelected. And when he got reelected, it was in one of the largest landslides ever. So in the election of 1972, Richard Nixon argued that he was representing the silent majority of Americans who didn't protest, who didn't cause trouble. They just went to work on a daily basis. And many Americans in both the North and the South saw that they wanted a more conservative viewpoint on how big the government should be and how much it should be involved in reform efforts. So when we look at the civil rights movement in the 1970s, many people in the civil rights movement realized that watching what the election is doing, they don't have a lot of Americans who are agreeing that we need to have a lot of change at this point. And in fact, a lot of Americans are voting saying that they are nervous about the changes that are taking place. In Denver, though, you've got a problem because in that political environment, you still have discrimination taking place. So this is one of the first school desegregation court cases that happened outside of the traditional Confederate South. And in this court case, the lower courts had ruled in Denver that the Denver school district was deliberately engaged in discrimination. They found evidence that in the Park Hill section of the Denver school district, there had been the building of schools and the making of school maps that made sure that all of the Black kids in the Park Hill region were clustered together. And that created an all white school surrounded by, an all Black school surrounded by all of these all white schools in the neighboring areas. A petition was created then that brought this court case. And for African American parents, they noticed that there were multiple other schools in the city that were also fairly segregated, but they didn't have evidence that those were created because of racial discrimination that was being done by the school district. But what they argued was by knowing that there was some discrimination that was done deliberately in Park Hill, they argued that the entire school district of Denver should be forced to desegregate. They wanted to make all of them now redraw all of their maps. And what that would mean is if that happened in our area, imagine if they decided next year to redraw the maps of Armstrong and Cooper. And that would mean that next year you might become a Cooper student if they discovered that there was a massive imbalance racially between the demographics of Cooper and Armstrong. If you were a Supreme Court justice, would you agree with the people who brought this court case that the entire Denver school district should be redrawn because they found racism in the Park Hill section? Or would you only say that the Park Hill section should be redrawn and the rest should be left alone? Please give your position and also support it with analysis using 3 sentences. And then I'll explain for you what the court actually did. Again, if you just jumped in a little bit ago, you will find on your description for today on your Google document, this is your Supreme Court Civil Rights Court cases sheet. We are doing some case studies of Supreme Court cases that tie into the civil rights movement. This is being recorded, so if you're just jumping in now, you can hang with, and then you'll be able to watch the recording later on. This activity will be due tomorrow. And what we're doing is we're asking you to put yourself in the position of a Supreme Court justice, decide how you would rule, and then I'll share with you how the Supreme Court was actually ruling when it came to these civil rights court cases. Take about 1 more minute to finish up your view. And again, you're trying to determine, should the entire school district be redrawn or just the Park Hill area? It is obvious that there has been a violation of Brown with what the Park Hill section was doing by trying to cluster all the African American kids into one school. About 15 more seconds. Now, it's at this point that this is our first court case that's dealing with segregation in the North and the West. And what a lot of kids will get into the mindset of is the one that was a little bit too simplistic around the time of the Civil War, the idea that racism is a Southern thing. But you've now seen the Red Summer of Hate in the 1919 time period. You've seen riots, the rise of the KKK in the 20s, again in the 1950s. You can have discrimination in the North quite easily, as you're aware of, as you can see here in the state of Minnesota as well. And so in Denver, they're trying to wrestle with, what are you doing with a place that doesn't have the history of the Confederacy and slavery? And what they determined in this court case is they said that school districts are responsible for their policies. And if it's discovered that they're behaving in a racially segregationist sort of way, then they very much need to get attention from the Supreme Court and they need to be forced to change their ways. They're violating the Constitution. And what the Supreme Court argued, and this is what can go down here, is they're going to say that because in the Park Hill area, the Denver school district showed that they were making decisions based on racial discrimination, it must be assumed then that when they drew the rest of the Denver school district boundary lines, they must have also had that. It's reasonable to assume that they had that in mind when they were drawing out the rest of the districts. So the decision of the Supreme Court was that the entire Denver school district map needed to be redrawn. So please jot that down for the Supreme Court decision in 1973. Supreme Court is going to determine that the city of Denver must redraw all of their maps, which means the following fall, a bunch of kids are going to be finding themselves going to a different school because of the fact that they had been going to schools that were divided up to maintain some racial segregation. Now, the next court case that we show you is where we find the civil rights movement then slowing down, because in 1974, we have the court case of Milliken versus Bradley. And especially if in the future you do plan on studying this further, especially taking a look at the question that Ava just asked when she was asking, what's the standpoint of Hispanics and other nationalities? In the city of Denver, you had not just an African-American population, you also had a Latino population as well that was finding themselves put into quadrants in order to maintain some semblance of segregation, even though they were a northern and a western city. And so we're going to find that at this point, there are still efforts going on for segregation, but then also the policies of the past, de facto racism and segregation, is going to come to bear. And that's where you're going to see that here. And you're going to see similarities between what's happening in Detroit in 1974 and what we currently have inside of our state. So this court case concerns the segregationist policies of the Detroit School District, which was the 5th largest school district in the nation in 1970. Several African-American students and the NAACP filed a lawsuit against Detroit, and they argued that they had evidence showing that when they drew the lines for the school district and attendance zones, they were deliberately trying to create white and black schools in the Detroit school district. And when this court case worked its way through the court system, lower courts beneath the Supreme Court found that, yes, there were efforts to segregate during the decades prior to 1974. The dilemma, though, that they had was that they had people who started moving. And one of the phrases they use for that is called white flight, where we have seen a trend in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. When you read about the 1950s, many people built the suburbs, moved to the suburbs, but they had a system called redlining, where they would draw red lines on a map to show areas that African Americans could not buy into, even if they had the money to do so. So certain neighborhoods, like the city of Edina, just south of our school district, was a segregated town that would not allow African Americans to buy in, and it was codified. In 1968, the Civil Rights Act got rid of that law, and so it's now illegal to discriminate in that sort of way. But many suburbs were then so expensive to buy into that African Americans still could not move in. The problem, though, is in Detroit. Because of white flight to the suburbs, the Detroit School District by this point was largely populated by African-American students. Almost all the white kids had moved out to the suburbs. So there really was no ability to desegregate unless you include the suburbs. A plan was created by Detroit and the court system to include majority white suburban school districts in the desegregation plan. So the plan that they're coming up with in Detroit is they're planning on taking districts like our Robbinsdale School District and putting them together with the Minneapolis School District into one mega district, and then using that clump to desegregate. The argument is that many African Americans previously could not move out into the suburbs because of segregation. Many now can't afford to do so. And it's believed that if you don't include the suburban school districts, there is no way to desegregate the school district of Detroit. Detroit will remain a predominantly black school district. The suburbs will remain predominantly white, and you will still have segregation. So the question that you need to wrestle with right here is, if you were on the Supreme Court, would you agree with this desegregation plan that we should erase the lines for not just the Detroit school district, but also the neighboring suburbs as well, and then redraw the lines to force the mixing of white and black populations to end segregation? Or do you feel like that's going too far? In your own words, then, in your own perception, then, so you can think about it from this perspective, that would mean that next school year, if we did that here in our city, it's pretty obvious that you can see, like in North Minneapolis, there's a much larger African American population than there is in Plymouth. That would mean next school year, you wouldn't attend Armstrong High School. There's a chance you would be bused to Minneapolis North, and kids at Minneapolis North would be bused to Armstrong in the effort to desegregate. So please take a moment and jot down your answer. Do you feel like that's the appropriate way to desegregate, or is that going too far? So Ava, I see your question. Did many people decide to leave this school district because they did not want to integrate? I'm assuming you're talking about Denver. This is, like I mentioned at the very beginning, one of the techniques that was used to avoid this sort of desegregation in the South in the 1940s through the 1970s was the creation of both private schools and religious schools. And if you take a look to the West in our school district, we have Providence Academy that very much allows that sort of segregation to remain, where in order to get into Providence, you must go through their application and acceptance process, which means that they can create an environment where they don't have to wrestle with the issues of desegregation or whatever. So some people choose that route if they're rich enough to be able to do so. A lot of people just start to resent what they see happening with these changes because they don't have the money and the ability to be able to move. So take a couple more minutes, please, to figure out what you're doing with the Milliken case. Take about one more minute to finish up with Milliken to think about whether or not you would be okay with breaking down those district boundaries between suburbs and the inner city. So let me give you the viewpoint then that the Supreme Court has. And this is now the Burger Court, 1974, and Richard Nixon has now successfully done to the Supreme Court what President Trump has been doing recently. He has now made the court more conservative, more willing to consider the idea of like states' rights, limited government, not so progressive, but instead more conservative in their viewpoints. And the argument that was made in Milliken versus Bradley is the Supreme Court said no to this plan. They said that the idea of inter-district desegregation is not constitutional. Now, what the Supreme Court said is that unless you can actually show evidence that when they were drawing the district boundaries between like Robbinsdale and Minneapolis or Detroit and their suburbs, if you could prove that that was done in a racially discriminatory sort of way to deliberately attack a certain racial group, then you could make a decision like this. But if it just turns out that you're drawing lines around neighborhoods and maybe those neighborhoods have certain ethnic compositions, that in and of itself does not then require the idea of breaking down multi-district boundary lines. Now you'll notice that what this means is that the suburbs that were created because of discriminatory reasoning, redlining and housing discrimination, whatever, that was ended by the Civil Rights Act of 1968, this decision is largely going to create school districts that are going to be heavily dominated by one race or another, depending on the demographics of who lives there. And one of the issues we need to wrestle with is this is now not just a racial divide, it's also an economic divide. And in particular, what we want to be noticing in the 1960s, when Martin Luther King gets shot in 1968, he's trying to make an argument that the next phase of his protest was going to be not just racial, but economic. And his argument that he was making was that there were white and black and other nationalities that should be united with the idea that inside the country, in the richest country on the face of the planet, they weren't doing well. In the Vietnam War also, he was making the argument that you stood a really good chance of ending up in combat in Vietnam, not based just on your race, but if you were economically rich or poor. Two of our most recent presidents were able to dodge the Vietnam War because of their wealth. For Bill Clinton, he was able to earn scholarships to be able to go study abroad over in England. And so he was able to dodge the Vietnam War in that way. President Trump's dad had a doctor who was able to diagnose Donald Trump with bone spurs in his feet that he probably could have fought through if he wanted to. But he was able to stay home and not go to the war. Poor people didn't have that option. So if you take a look at what's happening here, when Martin Luther King gets shot, he's trying to make the argument that we've got both racial and economic segregation taking place. And the best way to show that is with this chart that I've got for you right here. And this is where we very much start taking a look at what do we do from this point forward. So imagine if this map is our local area when it comes to schools. I'll have some kids who will tell me with a straight face about how they don't like Armstrong because of the fact, oh, we're so poor, we're so run down, we're so whatever. Imagine that these dollar signs are showing us our money that's going into the school district. You have portions of our district that are very wealthy. You've got some portions of our district that are more working class. But imagine if these are our tax dollars right here, and I put them into the wrong ring. So let me move them because we're a first ring suburb. The way that we pay for our schools, we get a little bit of money from the federal government. We get a little bit from the state. Most of our money comes from property taxes. Now, the problem is in Minneapolis, especially North Minneapolis, where we have a large African-American population, their property taxes aren't nearly what ours are. And so when it comes to their schools, their funding is a little bit different than ours. We get funded a little bit better than their schools do. So when we take a look at that situation, what Martin Luther King and others start pressing against is not just racial discrimination, but also economically. If you're in an area where one school is getting funded better than another, what are the outcomes going to be? You guys have one-to-one Chromebooks, which is making this e-learning easier, even though it's not easy. Compared to kids around the country who don't have that, there are some kids who, when they're told to e-learn, they don't have any devices to work with. Now, your problem is, if you look just west of us, we have Wyzetta that has like a college campus for a high school. It's beautiful. It looks amazing. Some of their houses give them property tax base that's even better than ours. And one of the questions we get to wrestle with is in the 1970s, the Supreme Court is going to argue that what we have now is going to become our status quo. The problem that we're facing, though, is what happens if we still have elements of racial segregation, and then also if African Americans here are getting paid less than these guys are in our neighborhood, but we're not getting paid like these guys are, and it has an impact on what sort of education you get. Your education is based on what sort of education everybody in the community can contribute towards. Is this equality? Is it inequality? Should the federal government be doing anything to fix this? And we are now at the point in our course where instead of me telling you what happened historically, I get to tell you that's become our normal. So it's pretty normal for kids to be able to understand that if you go to Minneapolis North High School, you will see a school that looks very much racially different than our school. Even though our school is more diverse than it was 40 years ago when I was going to school there, it's still something where you can see segregation in its place because we hit a point and then we got to Milliken and then we stopped. And that's where we're kind of just allowing people to move and fix things on their own. But as far as governmental action, it's been pretty slow since that time. So that's where we kind of move into with civil rights. We're going to find that with Richard Nixon, he's not like Lyndon Johnson. And that's what we're going to be studying this week and next week is Richard Nixon is more of the mindset that if you are African American, instead of having the government come in and fix things for you, he's more of that Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover rugged individualism. Maybe you should work for yourself, get educated, find a good job. Many people who are advocates of civil rights will highlight that that sounds pretty callous given the system that we're in. But for Richard Nixon, he'll see that as what a good American would do. And he's taking us all in a more conservative turn after all the changes we saw with Lyndon Johnson. So let me pause at this point. I'm going to check my chat to see if there's any questions or problems that have popped up. For this activity that you have right here, though, when you go to Schoology, you will find that there is, I forgot to change this over. So I'm still trying to figure this out. You will find inside of Schoology a Turnitin drop spot right here. Make sure you do that either today or tomorrow so that your grade will look good. If you jumped in a little bit late, what I was highlighting is the fact that this week, we are going to be getting ready for an assessment this Friday on chapters 23 through 25. You will want to go into your Schoology materials down here where you've got a breakdown sheet, and you should check to see if there are any things from this Unit 3 breakdown that you need help with that I can give you any sort of assistance with. Because of the fact that we've been doing distance learning, there's a solid chance there's some stuff that it isn't great for you at this time, but we can make it better. If you have any questions or problems, definitely feel free to let me know. But also please remember that you had this civil rights movement ed puzzle that I gave to you on Friday that I wanted done for today. If any of this stuff is throwing you off, please let me know. If you're having technological issues, please keep me in the loop. I very much miss having you guys here in class. But the thing that I also need to highlight for you is when we take a look at the news from the state, we're taking a look at what's going on with the coronavirus currently, and from friends of mine that I have inside the health industry, we're seeing both an increase. Yeah, and shoot, I made the mistake again. That's not what I want to do. They're seeing inside the state right now at our hospitals, and I'll bring this map up for you here. They're seeing an increase in the number of cases of coronavirus and also deaths, especially in the urban areas. So even though we had a protest last week arguing that we should be ending our social distancing, a lot of people who were protesting are people who very much are watching how out in the outstate areas there's not a lot of coronavirus popping up. They are finding in the city environments, though, we are starting to see the growth in the number of people who are being affected. And that's definitely something that is causing concern. And so I would be surprised if we end our social distancing anytime before May 4th. And then we'll be watching what's going to be going on with it after that time. If you feel satisfied that you're good at this point, then you can feel free to disconnect. Make sure you fill out the attendance for today so your attendance gets taken care of. Make sure you submit the work that you are doing today. Ava, I saw your question asking about case number 1, so I can absolutely go back to that. And feel free if you want to either type or else on mic. Let me first of all ask you, do you need me to go over the entire court case, or is there just something specific about it that's throwing you off? And I'm both listening for your microphone and also watching the chat to see what you give me.
I'll just unmute myself.
Okay.
I just like don't understand like the gist of it. Like I just don't understand like overall what they were trying to achieve. Because I
Sure.
understand like that they needed to tear out I wrote that they needed to tear out the racist systems, like the roots and branches, and that they needed to desegregate all facilities, like
Yeah.
teachers and transportation, which are the green factors, but I don't really understand like what I'm supposed to be writing my opinion about.
Yeah. So the opinion was when you take a look at what the school board is doing, the school board is trying to figure out in the new Kent case how they could essentially what the term that they're going to use in the legal community is they're trying to create a fig leaf. And if you've ever seen like old paintings where like people in the past got uptight about like nude paintings in Middle Ages, and so they put a fig leaf over people's like genital areas. That's a legal term that they use to allow you some cover to claim that you're innocent. And so, what the New Kent County School Board is doing is they're trying to claim that they're desegregating by giving kids the choice to go to whatever school they want to go to. But pretty much everybody in the world understands that if an African American kid shows up at the New Kent school, especially after you saw the footage of what happened at Little Rock, there's a solid chance that that kid understands that they're at least going to be treated with hostility. They may be attacked verbally. They may become the next Emmett Till, where they might be beaten and killed. So if you take a look at the numbers where they've done this plan for 3 years, the New Kent County Schools was trying to say, hey, look at what a great success we've had. We gave kids the choice. And they're trying to fall back on, man, kids must be so happy they're not making the choice to move. They must love where they are. And the African American kids are saying, no, we're frightened we're going to get terrorized. And so by putting the burden onto the kids, that's very much making sure that not many people will make that choice. On the other hand, if the government comes in and forces the New Kent County schools to change, where it says next school year, we're taking half of these kids who are in the white school and they're going to now go to the predominantly African American school and vice versa, then it's not a choice thing. You're being forced to do it. You then can't get attacked for being the one who's making the choice if you're an African American kid in middle school. And then what the Supreme Court's also thinking is if a bunch of white kids have to go to the traditionally black school, if the school isn't up to snuff, many of those white parents will then demand that it gets up to snuff, which will then create equality in their education. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. So are you good with that stuff, or is there anything more that you need help with?
Nope, I got it all done. Now I can finish that question, then I'll be done.
Fantastic. I regret having to do this one at distance because especially this gets us to the current connections that you're doing in an AP seminar, and so this is the stuff
Yeah.
I regret not being able to do in person. How's seminar going for you, by the way?
It's actually going very well. I mean, I've been pretty sick the last couple of days. I had
Oh
pink
no.
eye and all that stuff, but we're submitting our final drafts of our IWA